So first I want to introduce this incredible group of panelists. We're very lucky to have all of them here joining us. They're thought leaders, they're public servants, and they have very interesting insights to share as regulators or former regulators of the electric sector. So I'm going to start with Mr. Davante Lewis, the commissioner on the Louisiana Public Service Commission. Commissioner Lewis was elected in 2022 and took office in January of 2023 for a 6-year term. He covers the city of New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and the surrounding areas, so this is his home, and I think he can give a lot of interesting perspective about what we're dealing with here in Louisiana. We heard a lot from Governor Edwards this morning about some of that local reliability and wildfire and storm challenges, and so I know Commissioner Lewis will have something to say about that. I also, as part of their introduction, asked each of them to send me something interesting about them. So Commissioner Lewis is part of a trivia team that ranks in the top 10 in the state, so we'll try to find a way to put that into use during this panel or later this evening. Next to him, I have Chair Erik Helland from the Iowa Utilities Board. He was Iowa Utilities Commission, that's right, you're the commission now. Yes, you changed from the board to the commission. He was appointed by the governor in May of 2023, and he's been serving ever since, and he's also served as a chair, appointed by the governor to serve as a chair, and will serve as a chair for the first 2 years of his term. And I learned this about Chair Helland yesterday, that he is an aficionado of jazz music, really loves jazz music, and he himself plays the tenor saxophone.
Not well.
Yeah. Oh. Very interesting. Next to him, we have our neighbor from the great state of Mississippi. We have Mississippi PSC Commissioner DeKeither Stamps. He was elected to the commission in 2023 and took office in January of 2024 for a 4-year term. Prior to that, he was a legislator as well. And in addition to being a public servant, a regulator, a legislator, he also runs a calf farm, a 100-plus acre calf farm in Mississippi. So I don't know how he has time to do all of that, but it's very impressive. And then finally, you know Neil Chatterjee, former FERC commissioner, former FERC chair, served from 2017 to 2021, had a lot of great insights to share with us this morning when he and Governor Edwards did their fireside chat, but now is going to join these state regulators in providing the federal perspective, because there is truly a lot of collaboration between the federal and state regulation of the electric sector. So I first want to start by setting the stage for this panel, this regulator roundtable, and then I'm going to put each of these regulators in the hot seat and ask them some questions about their role, their insights into regulation, their insights into the transitions that are underway in the electric sector, and how we're mitigating some of the extreme weather events that we've been talking about throughout the session today. So just to sort of ground us in the role of the role of the regulator is incredibly important. We've heard that throughout the day today. The regulators, state regulators and federal regulators, regulate the electric sector. And typically that regulation applies to the investor-owned utilities at the state level. We heard in the last panel from the electric cooperatives. Most electric cooperatives do their own regulation via their board. As regulators are considering the impacts of extreme weather events, reliability, all of the things that we've been talking about over the last day, their foundational principle is ensuring that power is provided in a safe, reliable, and affordable manner. And pretty much every state has that built into their charter, either the state constitution or the state legislation that sets up their commission. And so we're going to talk about the intersection between that, safety, reliability, and affordability as it relates to this utilization of new technologies to solve societal problems. So let's start at a high level. And I'm going to start with the state regulators first, and then we'll talk to Neil for the federal regulatory perspective. As you are reviewing and approving utility investments in items like resilience, vegetation management, which we've talked a lot about today, I'd like for you to talk at a high level about how you as a regulator are looking at what the utilities are investing in and how you're balancing those investments with risk, affordability, reliability, and the like. So, Commissioner Lewis, we'll start with you.
Absolutely. Well, first, thank you all for being here in the amazing city of New Orleans. We are always happy to have people visit. As the commissioner that represents here, I like to welcome everyone, what I say, to the best public service commission district in the country. But to answer your question, the reason why I say that is because here in Louisiana particularly, I represent, as Angela said, starting at the port of Baton Rouge through the Mississippi River and what we call the river parishes, and concluding here in the city of New Orleans, all of the topics that regulators think about really exist here in this area. We are in a severe natural disaster cone, of course, when you think about hurricanes, but we've seen the increase of flooding, the increase of winter storms, and even last year had some significant challenges with wildfires. And then we also are one of the poorest states in the nation. So when we are talking about reliability, sustainability, resiliency, and affordability, we have a real challenge here. And I think high level, what we are looking at, especially as a regulator in Louisiana, is what does that look like? How do we make those investments every time we think about it? I mean, when I think about the communities I represent, oftentimes they are not equipped to be able to evacuate or quickly move, which means reliability is extremely important. So that is looking at vegetation management, that is looking at grid enhancing technologies, that is looking at, are we catching utility poles that should be replaced fast enough? Because we know people aren't going to be able to leave, so that recovery time has to be improved. And so we are seeing this. Live example of just about a month ago when Hurricane Francine came in, we compared the last two storms that took a very similar path of Francine, which was Hurricane Ike and Hurricane Gustav, one a little stronger, one a little weaker. At both of their peaks, we saw approximately around 1.2 million Louisianians without power. Because of the investments that we've made in resiliency, because of the enhancements we did in vegetation management, we peaked only at 400,000 without power, and within 24 hours we were down to only 20% being without. And so we are looking at what is those investments. We are talking about what type of rules should we have around resiliency, but also what investments should utilities make in resiliency, and how are they using new technologies as a way to make those investments.
That's great. Chair Helland, how about your perspective from Iowa?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you to Commissioner Lewis. Love your hometown. It's been beautiful and been great. Please don't ask me to play the saxophone. Angelo was incorrect. I own one. So vegetation management means something very different in Iowa. We are 85% tillable. So if we're not building something on it or paving it, it's probably got corn on it. And so when we manage vegetation, we literally produce 2.5 billion bushels a year and largely ship them down to you. And so we have an incredible infrastructure. And, I jokingly tell some of the risk rating agencies, if, the state of Iowa, if our green cornfields are on fire, we have much bigger problems because we're all probably going the way of the dinosaurs. But realistically for us, it means risk management in a different sense. And so we are grappling and dealing with larger, more catastrophic storms, whether they be derechos. We get several hundred tornadoes a year. It's a little less predictable. How they come in, where they go, what they hit becomes harder to predict. But we also have sustained winds, which has been really beneficial. We are at this point about 55% wind, which is great, except that wind constantly blows, and that puts a different stress on an entire grid system that you have to deal with because the longevity of the infrastructure is impacted, and so we have to consistently look at not just how our grid is managed and used, but are we on the appropriate depreciation cycles? And then I think, and it's a little bit more abstract. I think there's clearly savings to be had for ratepayers and investors in the sense of, are we mitigating risk appropriately? But at the end of the day, for utilities, the cost of capital is enormous, and that is ultimately borne by ratepayers. And so for us as a state, if there's steps we can take to demonstrate what our real risk profile is, I think that translates down not just to reliability, but to affordability. And I spend a lot of my time sometimes going in circles with some of the risk folks from the coasts who just assume that there's a whole bunch of trees starting on the west bank of the Mississippi, and they extend all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And it's like, hey, Iowa doesn't look like Idaho, So don't throw us into that same risk profile and then come and yell at us in a year because, our utilities have been gold plating. And so for us, understanding that risk profile helps us, guide and ask the appropriate questions so that capital is being applied appropriately, and that ultimately our ratepayers are getting a reliable product that's not overly expensive.
Well, I want to appreciate my colleague for being a great host. You've always been a good friend, and Mississippi and Louisiana have a shared economy, especially on the coast, and especially how we govern. Specifically at the Mississippi Public Service Commission, the three commissioners there, we get along well. We work together in an amicable way, but more importantly, we provide a little cover politically so that the utility companies can just do your job. Let us deal with more of the politics and the people, and the utility operators like Mr. Fasackley over at Entergy. Let us deal with the politics of it. You focus on your institution and doing your level at a high level, so your job at a high level, so we can all function better together. And beyond from that, making good investments. We got data centers coming to Mississippi. I'm planning to have about 6 more of them before I leave the Public Service Commission. So we're just going to keep working and building capacity and using new technologies to grow our economy and to provide down pressure on our rates.
Great. Neil, so your role as a former federal regulator is a little different than the state regulatory construct, right? Why don't you talk a little bit about how you evaluated resilience and adaptation from the perspective of your time at FERC?
Yeah, look, I want to start by saying that from a federal regulatory perspective, to be honest, we really look to the states, and that cooperative federalism, the cooperation between the federal government and the state government was so essential. And so I want to start off by just complimenting my 3 colleagues here who are serving their country in really, really important roles. I don't think that as a citizen, prior to my taking a seat at FERC, I fully appreciated how important public utility commissioners, public service commissioners were to the functioning of a state, to reliability, to affordability. And so I just want to thank the 3 of you for your continued service to your states and to our country. I also will have to say, when I worked in the United States Senate, my boss would say that everybody is on the team, but not everybody is an all-star. During my tenure at FERC, there were a lot of great state commissioners who were on the team, but Angela Navarro was an all-star. And I just wanted to take the moment to acknowledge her contributions to our country and to this dialogue. And from my perspective, looking at these critical issues, really having had the privilege of sitting in the seat that I had as a FERC commissioner and FERC chair, I depended on you all a lot on this because we didn't have jurisdiction on the distribution side. We worked with NERC in setting standards to try and have processes in place to get ahead of these potential situations, but it was really working with my state colleagues that put us in a position to have success. And where it hit me the most, how important this state-federal cooperation was actually during the pandemic. I think probably my proudest moments when I reflect back on my tenure at FERC were that we kept the lights on during the height of the pandemic. And so many people have come to me in the aftermath and said, Neil, with everything else that we were facing, with all the trials and tribulations being posed by COVID, the fact that the lights stayed on, we couldn't have borne that. If the lights had gone off on top of everything else, how would we have dealt with that? And that didn't happen by accident. It happened because state commissioners and federal commissioners have been working together for years to get ahead of these things, because I had relationships with people like Angela who I could pick up the phone and call and figure out how to navigate these complex dynamics. It's so, so essential. So this is my long-winded senatorial way of saying I appreciate the opportunity to be here on the stage today to discuss this important topic. And while the federal role is important, it's really these folks at the state level that are on the front lines making these critical decisions. And it's just an honor for me to be on this stage with them. I will say two other things. One, I loved being on the stage with Governor Bell Edwards this morning. I noticed several of you sent me beautiful pictures of it. I was wearing dress shoes and athletic socks, and it was a terrible combo. So that's why I'm wearing sneakers right now to remedy that. And then Angela didn't ask me what my personal,
I was gonna save that for last.
Oh,
Such a
all right.
good
I didn't want to mess up.
Yeah, it's such a good one. Yeah, you're right. No, I did not. Okay, so we'll talk about Neil's talent because it's very interesting and different, and I thought it would be a good closing. But I do appreciate your remark on federal-state cooperation because I think we all see that in our roles. I used to serve as a regulator, served during the pandemic, had a great working relationship with the Honorable Neil Chatterjee as well. But I want to talk a little bit more about the role of the regulator and also the external view of the regulator, okay? So I don't think it's any surprise to any of us that oftentimes regulators hear the pace of regulation is so slow. It takes a long time to get things to happen. And we've talked a lot today about the pace of innovation, and the pace of technological change is so swift and so rapid. So I want to go a little deeper. We started at the high level of, sort of what is your role? How are you looking at these extreme weather events? How are you addressing resilience and reliability and balancing that with affordability? Now I really want to talk about how commissioners, and these three commissioners in particular, and then Neil, I want to hear your perspective as well, are embracing technological innovation, embracing utility plans to implement technological innovation. How are you thinking about that as a regulator, given the historical perception of the regulatory construct as being incredibly slow to move and to progress? Let's start with you.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I think it first starts with us regulators. And the reason I say that is because the industry that we are regulating, not by any ineptitude, is risk averse. It is not meant to be an innovative process because they are looking for a constant, stable regulatory environment. So to embrace emerging technologies, it almost has to start with the regulator because if you are being honest, a utility is only going to move what they know they may get cost recovery for, what a regulator will approve. And so that innovation in emerging technology, enhancing the grid, GTEs, DERs, whatever you may say, I think really has to start from the policy aspect of the regulator. And oftentimes I think because of our system, we kind of get caught in the quagmire of, are we just constantly reviewing utility applications, or also are we setting policy decisions to embrace that innovation and that movement? And so I think those are places where we have to lead. One of the things that I have done to make sure that we are doing that is I asked all of our utilities to constantly every month file a report within the commission on what federal grants that they're applying for. So we can see that and we can evaluate that. Or I just send a letter to all of our utilities asking what grid enhancing technologies do you either have in flight, are you considering, are not applicable? And so we can now work with the Department of Energy's loan office to say, hey, if we're making some of these investments, I would say my utilities are probably not willing to do that until they saw the engagement to say, hey, I may get a better regulatory framework because the commissioner's interested in that. And so I think that is really the challenge with the slow pace of regulation. It's really who bites first. Is the utility going to ask first, or is the regulator going to ask the question first?
Yeah, that's a really good perspective. Chair Helland, how are you considering the pace of innovation in Iowa?
You open up a can of worms. To build on Commissioner Lewis's point, utilities are not notorious for being on the bleeding edge of innovation. But you know who's worse? Government. And so it's in the state of Iowa, we're actually, to a certain extent, we're pulling a page out of Mr. Chatterjee's playbook when he was at the FERC, and documenting all of our data and trying to figure out, how do we use it intelligently, and then reaching out to the stakeholders and trying to figure out, what they're reporting to us, and as we work through that, we start finding correlations between different data sets. And so when you start looking at, using AI, not just to manage the actual grid itself, but also vegetation management or load profiles, you start creating pools of data, and when you can start drawing correlations that you didn't necessarily see before, you get greater insights. And I'm a very big believer, whenever you start implementing analytics or machine learning or AI, whatever you want to do, and to be honest with you, at the state level, we're going to need to run or walk before we run, and so we're years away from being able to make prescriptive decisions, but we are at a point where we should be able to draw more descriptive correlations and make better policy decisions, and it's just going to take a little bit of time, and so it's frustratingly painful, but there are those that have come before us and done it, and I think the biggest challenge as you start into it is not trying to boil the ocean. It's really easy to get overwhelmed, and so we have a data team within our agency, and we meet every single week, and I go as the chair every single week. It's the only meeting I go to every week, and part of it's to say, hey, this is really important, and the other part is to say, don't get overwhelmed. Pick a couple lighthouse projects, figure out what you're doing, and start building around it. And so I think the more products that come online through the industry, and I do think, because we are dealing in a rate-regulated market, it's a little distorted. And so while we often are almost always setting prices and also determining prudency, we also, as regulators, need to kind of serve as a market signal and demand innovation. The tech sector and most of the other sectors, the market itself is saying innovate now or die. And they have to, and so because we don't deal in a universe like that, I think as regulators we have to educate ourselves and start asking our utilities, like, well, hey, they're doing this down in Louisiana, because how does this look within your business model? But it's a steep learning curve.
Yeah, that's a great perspective. Commissioner Stamps, we were chatting a little bit before this about the pace of data center growth in Mississippi, and you've mentioned that, and I think data centers are also a source of innovation in and of themselves, right? They're processing machine learning, processing AI, housing a lot of the things that we need to live our lives every day. How is that sort of challenge of meeting that growth with new sources of technology, new sources of innovation? How are you thinking about that and balancing that in Mississippi?
When you do these panels, you want to sound so educated and smart. But I was getting off the elevator and it hit me that 20 years ago, we all thought we knew how to get on the elevator, because elevator technology has been, pretty the same for a long time. But someone came along with the idea, if you just put your number in there and let AI figure out which elevator to get on, you'll stop that little log jam to get on the elevator. And over time, with the changing of human behavior, we've changed how to get on the elevator, when 20 years ago, we thought we knew how to get on the elevator. Well, when it comes to AI for the utility industry and vegetation management and all those things, if we could just change a little human behavior, change a few things, we can change how we do things normally in a more effective way, similar to how we have figured out how to use AI to change how to use elevators. Conversely, with data centers and AI, for a state like mine, we're not seeing population increase. We're seeing population decrease. So I have a system that costs more to utilize, and I have less users on the system. So the smart thing in our state is to go after new industries like data centers, because I-55 and I-20 is some of the fastest fiber in the whole world, between Dallas and Atlanta and Chicago and New Orleans. So now let me turn some cornfields into some data centers so that we can in turn have down pressure on our rates, stabilize our whole system, and move ourselves forward and figure out some unique ways of using that elevator example throughout our whole utility space.
I support you taking cornfields out of production too.
Well, in my state, I have 1.7 million acres of unused farmland.
Yeah.
So if I have 1.7 million acres of unused farmland, I'm not hurting the agricultural industry. Actually, I'm stabilizing that industry because a data center that takes up 900 or 1,000 acres stabilizes that tax base for that county, that school system is better, and it creates jobs in a new industry that I don't have to go out and pursue that. So that helps us in multiple ways.
Yeah, that's a great point. Neil, you have an interesting perspective because you've served in Capitol Hill, you've served at FERC, now you're at a law firm counseling corporate clients. What is your advice on this disconnect between the pace of innovation and the pace of regulation? And how do you see that as an opportunity for companies that are trying to grow and prosper and thrive and really find ways to leverage that pace of innovation in an industry that is so heavily burdened by the pace of regulation?
Yeah, look, when I first was told I was going to be on this panel today, I was a little intimidated about it, but then he doesn't even realize that we were on the elevator together. And so I realized I was the one that gave him this elevator idea around AI. And so I was like, oh no, maybe I do know what I'm talking about.
Right.
In this regard. Now, in all seriousness, look, this is one of the big challenges, is that the energy transition is really being driven by technological innovation. And so for those of us who serve in the regulatory space or as policymakers, we've got to make sure that we can keep pace with the speed of that innovation, and that can be a challenge. And then when you particularly take it back to an industry like electric utilities, kind of forcing change can be a challenge, because at the end of the day, all of us have a responsibility to make sure the lights come on. Unlike every other facet of our economy, those of you all who have phones on you right now, if your phones work, you know, you've got to log into the Wi-Fi on the table here. If your phones work 90% of the day today, you'll be kind of happy. You'll be mildly annoyed for the 10% of the time that you didn't have connection, but you're okay with it. If the lights went out for even a minute, we would all melt down. So it is our foremost responsibility to ensure that reliability. And whenever you're talking about incorporating something new, the knee-jerk reaction, the inherent instinct is, well, hold on, what is this new technology and what might it mean for electric reliability and affordability? And this is something I actually dealt with, in a frontline way when I was at FERC. I am proudest that I moved a couple of FERC orders to remove barriers to entry to innovative new technologies. FERC Order 841 removed barriers to entry for energy storage, and FERC Order 2222 removed barriers to entry for aggregated distributed energy resources to enable these resources to be compensated for all of their attributes, for energy, for capacity, and for ancillary services, to give them the opportunity to compete. And I was very proud of these initiatives, but just to be totally candid, I was sued by NARUC, by EEI, by NRECA, by APPA, because they felt that I had overstepped my authority into state-level retail and distribution jurisdiction, and that it was an overreach. Ultimately, the DC Circuit stood by the approach that I took, and I was able to prevail. But even now, I'm 3 years removed from my time at FERC, and we're seeing, kind of still a lack of willingness to open the door to these new technologies. And that just seems to be the case. I do a lot of work in the dynamic line rating space, ambient adjusted ratings, looking at kind of how to better harness efficiencies for transmission. Similarly, utilities who see benefits from this are still reluctant to adopt it, but I promulgated a FERC Order 881, which has a compliance obligation, so utilities are at least going to have to come to the table in terms of that compliance obligation. When it comes to vegetation management, when it comes to this incredible opportunity that AI Dash offers. Part of the challenge, and I love utilities, I love my friends in the utility industry, and I want to work with them, but they're small C conservatives, and I understand it, I get it. They have to be very cautious, they have to be judicious with ratepayer dollars, with ratepayer revenues. They have to be responsive to their state regulatory authorities, and in the wholesale markets to their federal regulator. And so I understand that reluctance to kind of engage when there's new innovative technologies that are there. But we have to get over that. We have to overcome that. And that's why I think forums like this, bringing you all in the audience, plus state regulators, plus a former federal regulator here to talk about it, is so critically important, because there's opportunity here. There's opportunity here for ratepayers, there's opportunity here for the utilities, and there's opportunities here for these commissioners to look good to their ratepayers if we can find smart solutions to move forward. But it's going to take all of us having trust, being educated, having full information, and then deciding, this is the right prudent step to take going forward. I understand there's reluctance, but that's why a forum like this is so critically important to help us move forward.
That's great. Well, I love that optimistic, forward-looking approach, and I'm actually going to center my next set of questions around that concept. So none of us has a crystal ball, right? We don't know what the future is going to hold, but we do know two truths. One is that much of the challenges that the utility sector is facing, the electric sector is facing today, are challenges that we are going to see into the future, right? Addressing load, growing load, managing your transmission and distribution system, balancing the management of that system with extreme weather events that are becoming more frequent. At the same time, the pace of technological innovation, the use of satellite imagery paired with AI, the ability to adapt to utilizing those new technologies is also a reality that we're facing. I'm interested in hearing from you, each of you actually, how you're thinking about the future of regulation. If you could wave that crystal ball 3-5 years ahead, where are we going to go as regulators, and what are going to be the big sort of hot topics in terms of addressing these regulatory challenges, not just now, but in the future?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think we have an opportunity, I think, as you said, and where Neil was going, and I am very supportive of FERC Order 2022, and been pushing my commission to move faster since the court case. But I think we have a system that we can start to pair some of our challenges, and what I mean by that is if we improve our system, basically let's looking at the distribution level and using distribution data at a census tract, we can pair using AI for, let's say, energy efficiency and modernization and demand response, right? We typically look at the grid and our regulations in silos. But I am thinking about how we can utilize this innovation in a well-rounded approach for all of the things that we are doing. Right, I know if I'm looking at census tract information where my most impoverished or disadvantaged communities are. I can therefore then pair that with reliability data, whether to see, should I invest more in vegetation management here in this community because I'm looking at the historical weather patterns. I'm seeing that extreme weather is coming here, and so I can advance some of that projection to say, well, I know this community is not going to be able to evacuate from a hurricane, therefore let me upfront vegetation management here, and then also utilizing that data from, let's say, distribution reliability standard to say, this is also a place where I should invest, maybe demand response or energy efficiency, are using data aggregation as a way to showcase. And so, I mean, I think when we're looking 5 years from now, we can solve so many problems if we connect them, utilizing the technology that is expanding rather than kind of separating them as we have traditionally done in regulation, which is we're looking at sustainability over here, we're looking at reliability over here, we're looking at affordability over here, and recognizing how if we pair these systems together, that utilizing, in Louisiana we regulate the electric co-ops. So having them being able to now utilize satellite images, we are catching a lot faster equipment that needs to be updated, poles that need to be replaced, crosshairs that are broken, that significantly lowers the rate shock that we typically see from an electric co-op who may have a stable rate for 15 years, recognizes their line of credit is challenging and now comes in for a $15 to $20 rate increase. We can now upfront that utilizing that technology. So where I really see us going in 3 to 5 years is how do we build these systems to integrate with one another on the challenges that are always going to stay on when we are talking about the utility business in a way that addresses all the issues at one time.
Yeah, very interesting to hear how you're already looking at technology to help improve reliability and reduce cost on your system. Yeah, that's great. Chair Helland.
It's somewhat corny, but I find myself using the example or analogy all the time. But in the movie Moneyball, there's a scene where Brad Pitt is talking to his team of scouts, and there's a old guy in one corner saying, "I think this player is good because of insert anecdotal," and then his opinion. And on the other end, there's a quant sitting there saying, "Nope, this person's a better value because of X. This person's a better value because of X." Well, if you fast forward a decade and a half later, every single team is now making decisions with quants. Every single NFL team is making decisions with an analytics program. This is coming in every single sector. And so what I constantly tell our people is, don't be that old guy at the end of the table saying, well, I think, I feel, you've got to be able to look back at rational, real data and start making data-driven decisions. Because a lot of the decisions we make are hard. They're really difficult. And if you can hang your hat on being able to point to the efficacy of a program because you said we applied this amount of money and we know this was the return and it is this much more reliable or it is this much more affordable for this population, you can start demonstrating and measuring those programs. And I think Peter Drucker, made a comment at some point that if you can measure it, you can improve it. And that applies to everything that we do, but it also applies to our agencies ourselves. And so we are in the process of looking internally and mapping every point along the way of every one of our processes so that we can start establishing KPIs and exceptions reports so that we can start making sure that we are as effective as possible. Because when I start looking out 5 years down the road, particularly in a state so dependent on renewables and at the crossroads of all of those renewables, it's transmission, 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 transmission. That's all we do all day long. And we build a lot of wind, and we have to do it fast. We don't know necessarily what load growth is going to be, but we know it's big and we know it's coming. And at the end of the day, I do not relish the idea of sitting in front of the public or the legislature or the governor and saying, we're the bottleneck. I mean, we absolutely need to be prudent. We need to do our job, but we have to find a way to do it faster and more effectively. And I think a lot of that is going to be adopting some of these private sector practices of looking internally and applying some of these metrics and analytics to ourselves as well.
Commissioner Stamps, what do you see as the future of regulation in Mississippi?
I think all leaders should leave everyone with direction and purpose. And one way that we've used growth to help solve problems, inside my district, I serve part of the Mississippi Delta, one of the poorest areas in the whole country. A lot of disinvestment over many, many decades. And with one data center project, we were able to negotiate a new production facility to add production capacity. And through the Amazon deal and work with our energy partners, we're putting $1 billion into the Mississippi Delta because there was due to be decommissioned a gas-fired plant. And so while we were negotiating, I said, well, if we're going to decommission a plant, you're going to need redundancy. So let's turn the parking lot into a new plant and turn one switch off on one and turn the switch on another one. And in a few short minutes, common sense prevailed. And now the Mississippi Delta is getting $1 billion from the Amazon deal and the data center that's going on in Madison County for redundancy. But more importantly, their reliability is going to go up because now their power is going to continue to be produced close to their homes versus a long ways away in LaFleur County, which was where it was due to be. Their power was going to be switched around. So now we can use growth to invest in spaces where there's been disinvestment and not have the ratepayers, not have the residential ratepayers shoulder the burden for these big ticket production items and allow for a hyperscaler to dive in and work it out so we can produce a better a better light bill and better reliability for our ratepayers.
Yeah, that's great.
This is a basic example,
Yeah.
but many more
Yeah,
like that.
absolutely. Yeah, but I think that sort of shows the connection between a state that's addressing load, right, and addressing aging assets. And we've been talking a lot about assets, transmission, distribution system assets, and now you actually have a significant new customer who can help to pay for that system, right? And so that is something that a lot of states, we're always talking about the states that are sort of just in growth mode, but not necessarily on the states that are also thinking about how do you supplement the demand. And it sounds like that's something that you're really focusing on in Mississippi.
Oh, most definitely. And I want to double the capacity of the Grand Gulf Nuclear Power Plant, but that takes relationships. We had to do some things with Louisiana because we were sharing that production capacity. And so now we're moving forward to go down that road as well.
And then that frees up the ability for the utility to invest in new types of innovative technologies to maintain their system.
Exactly.
So they're not just thinking about the legacy system, but they're thinking about the future. Neil, you're probably going to be the one to close us out. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the future of energy regulation from the federal perspective and how that's sort of blending with the conversation that we've been having today, that you started off, that you kicked off with Governor Edwards this morning, and that we'll be wrapping up here after this session. I'm just interested in your thoughts as a leader in this space on where you think we're going and how we can help to enable that transition.
So the word regulation is very hot button. And I think it's interesting. I think most of us in this room, particularly those of us who are from the Midwest and the Southeast, when we hear regulation, we tend to have an inherently negative reaction because regulation tends to mean something onerous that is going to increase costs and put on additional burdens. I, for one, during my time as an aide in the US Senate, worked with my principal to fight against regulations because we truly believe those regulations to be onerous. When I got to FERC, what I recognized that not all regulatory bodies are the same. And I actually, when I take a step back and I look at the jurisdiction and the role of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, as well as these various state commissions, yes, they're quote unquote regulatory bodies, but I don't view them as onerous regulatory bodies the way that I might view in EPA. I actually view FERC and a number of state commissions as enabling authorities and as regulations enabling action, not inhibiting it. And so from my perspective, I have seen firsthand the benefit to consumers, to the economy, and to the environment from enabling regulations that promote competition, that promote innovation. So in this space in particular, I think there is a huge opportunity for utilities, for energy providers to embrace AI and technical innovation and replace kind of outmoded methods that are not only insufficient from a reliability perspective, but that are also economically inefficient. Take advantage of the opportunity that technical innovation is presenting to us. But sometimes it takes a nudge. And if that nudge comes from a FERC order or from a state PUC order, don't view that nudge in the same way that you might look at a command and control EPA regulation. It's different. There are enabling regulations and there are inhibiting regulations. I think some kind of regulatory policy that promotes and incentivizes investments and gives utilities the right, sort of desire and incentive to want to invest in these kinds of futuristic technologies to get ahead of risks around wildfires and vegetation management. I view that as enabling regulation. And I would hope that that would be something that federal regulators, state regulators, Republicans, Democrats, industry, and consumers could all get on board with.
That's great. Well, I think we've had an amazing conversation this afternoon, a really wonderful conversation this afternoon around where we are, where the regulatory space is currently, the context of the regulatory space, both from the federal and the state level, how regulators can help to spur technological innovation by working with our utilities and ensuring that they're meeting the moment, just as the regulators don't want to be the roadblocks. I did promise you before we left that I would tell you Neil's fun fact, and it is a very interesting one, and I think it actually meets the moment of the theme of this conference of evolve. So we've talked a lot about technological innovation, but Neil himself has evolved as a human, and he can now hold his breath underwater for 2.5 minutes. And I think that is just so incredibly impressive that I wanted to end the panel with that.
I don't recommend it. I hyperventilate in advance to do it, but it works.
All right, well, thank you for your time and attention. Please join me in thanking this wonderful panel for all of their insights this afternoon. We really appreciate you guys for being here.